Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you may be joining us from. My name is Steve Hoffman, Director of Business Development with GTN, and welcome to today's webinar, How to Respond to the New Long-Term Remote Worker. We have over 500 people registered for this event, so I'm just going to give it about another 60 seconds for folks to get logged in, settled in, so we'll officially begin then. All right, still got quite a few people in the midst of joining. Give it about another 30 seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Everybody, Steve Hoffman here with GTN. Welcome to today's webinar, How to Respond to the New Long-Term Remote Worker. Today's webinar is brought to you by Alliant Employee Benefits, GTN Global Tax Network, and Littler Mendelson. As a reminder, this is the first webinar of part of a three-part series. The second webinar is going to be the new short-term remote worker. That will be on March 24th. And then how to respond to the commuter conundrum. That'll be on April 28th. All of these are going to be at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. As a reminder, all attendees will be muted. During the panel discussion, audience members will have the opportunity to ask questions. We ask that you use the chat feature. And we will start looking at these questions about halfway through the webinar and address them. If we don't get through all of them, we will follow up by email and see if we can help you that way. Because we do only have about 60 minutes to get to everything done here. This is an educational webinar, and we're happy to have Ruoff Mortgage sponsor our continuing education credits for CRP and GMS credits, 1 credit each. The live version is seminar ID is 16453, that's 16453. The recorded version, seminar ID is 16472, 16472. And our friends over at Quicken Loans were kind enough to get us continuing education credits for SHRM and HRCI. So the activity ID for the SHRM is 21-3XRSN, 21-3XRSN. And then the activity ID for HRCI is 551595. Again, that's 551595. Now we're going to get into our panelists. We have Richard Polak, Senior Global Advisor at Alliant Insurance Services, Trent Sutton, Global Workforce Attorney at Littler Mendelson, PLC, David Libet, National Practice Leader, Business Travelers at GTN, and Cheryl Craig, Senior Manager, Global Talent Mobility at VMware. I would like all the panelists to please turn on their webcams and their microphones. So I will stop sharing my PowerPoint. And
I'm second. Darn, I wanted to be first. Hey, beat me.
I know, I was poised ready, Richard.
All right, I just need to figure out how to, all right. I assume, have I stopped sharing my screen? Does that show up when you're ready? Good, wonderful. All right, well, to start things off, I'd like to go through the list. Richard, you're not gonna go first. In fact, you're gonna go last. I'm gonna have all of the, panelists just tell us a little bit about themselves, your background, and maybe give a brief overview of long-term remote workers and how it affects your particular field of expertise. So to start things off, we're going to go to my colleague, David.
Thank you very much, Steve. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. David Libet, and as Steve mentioned, I head up our business traveler and remote worker, as that's become a bit more of an issue the last 12 months. I've got 20 years experience in mobility tax, and in the last sort of 7 or 8, probably specializing in that sort of business traveler, remote working kind of space. What are we seeing over the last 12 months? Well, it's what a fascinating 12 months it's been. last year started very differently to where it ended, and I think just from a pivot perspective in terms of moving away from traditional assignments, business travelers to that remote working space, it started out, I felt, very much like reactionary, very much people trying to get their arms around what was going on and where people were, making sure they were safe, etc. And now it's very much forming into distinctive buckets, hence the reason for our series. And the long-term sort of remote workers, whilst they, in my view, just very briefly, because I know we're coming on to the case studies, but they often seem to be the simplest ones, but there's a lot more to it. There's a little bit more to it than just sort of permanently becoming a remote worker. And as we're seeing, there's some interesting scenarios coming up. So lots of issues to talk about today, Steve.
All right, thank you, David. Now we're going to go all the way over to Singapore, where Trent Sutton, can you take the next part?
Sure. My name's Trent. I'm an international employment attorney, what does that mean? It essentially means that I help you hire the people you love and fire the people you hate, wherever they are in the world. That's in this program, what I do is answer the question that comes from HR, internal legal, which usually starts with something like, oh my gosh, I didn't know he was in whatever country. Now what do I do? So in the last, remote work has always been a challenge from the employment law perspective and managing entitlements and benefits. But with the last 12 months, we've obviously seen employees taking a much more perhaps aggressive role and working from home wherever they want. And what does that mean for employees? Or employers. That's what we'll talk about.
Excellent. Thank you, Trent. Now we're going to go to one of my neighbors and friends, Cheryl Craig of VMware.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Cheryl Craig. I am located outside of Boston, and I am the senior manager at VMware for their global mobility program. And yes, this year has been a wild ride for sure. I think what's very interesting about the remote worker in the tech industry is this has been on the tech industry's agenda, I think, for a while now. We had started to see before the pandemic more workers going to a remote fashion. I myself have been remote for 6 years now, so I'm a long-term remoter. And I think what we've also seen is the need for offering that flexibility and the need for opening up our talent pool. So this has been on the minds of our company and others in our industry for a long time now. Obviously, the pandemic really pushed it forward. So I'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but we went through a whole initiative of offering what's called future of work. So deciding if you're going to be remote, are you going to be fixed, or are you going to be flexible? Remote means you're likely not near an office and you won't be going in. Fixed means we need you near an office, but not necessarily in every day. I'm sorry, fixed is you're actually going to be in an office every day, and so you're going to be close to an office. And then flexible is when you're going to be near an office. So some of our sales role, we need you, in a region, or we need you tied to an office, but we don't necessarily need you in every day. So we rolled that out last September, and what my team has been working on is specifically those international remote folks. So working on rolling out a whole plan for employee requested moves that have come out of this. So that's what's going on in my world.
Oh, it sounds like you've been very busy, and we appreciate you joining us today. Now, last but not least, we got Richard Polak.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Steve, Dave, Cheryl, and Trent. I'm very pleased to be here. In my world, with employee benefits and human resources, all international, because that's all we do in this end of the business is global human resources and employee benefits. We're really looking at 4 core benefits, and this applies to anybody anywhere in the world. Any human being is they have a need to save for retirement. They have a need if they become ill, they have some sort of medical program or services. And they have a need if they become disabled. And then finally, should they pass on, there needs to be security for their loved ones. So refer to these the core benefits, and I don't want to go necessarily in the evolution of how that became that, but all those benefits need to be delivered to employees no matter where they live at any given moment for each individual. at any given time. And what we'll talk about is those benefits, plus now that the world has shifted. In fact, if you looked at the Earth around the sun, the equator really isn't in the center. It's in the center of the Earth, but the Earth's on an axis, right? So you can be here and facing the sun on this end, be 30 degrees below. So in any given moment, and I look at the analogy in employee benefits, now the world is moving and we're shifting more towards fringe benefits than the core benefits. The fringe benefits becoming much more important, particularly during this environment where you have all those family-friendly benefits. You've got issues dealing with having to get people on computers in areas where there is no internet or spotty internet. What do you do about reimbursing for expenses and so on? Is it a reimbursable expense? What are the taxation issues? We even had a client with, I mean, they have no tracking system, and that's a big one now that's coming about. In fact, I'd love to hear Cheryl's perspective on that, because now there's become tracking systems that become available. But before, we had a client that literally tracked everybody finally and found out there's 400 people in their company that aren't living where they said they were living when they filled out the form that said where they are, right? And one of them, or actually, sorry, 30 of them from this client are living in places that there's no legal entity. And so there's no basis or foundation for an employee benefit plan to secure their benefits. So that's what we'll be talking about on my end. Hope that's helpful.
That's it. That is helpful. And Richard, I understand you recently published a book.
Oh, well, I've written a book, and it will be published by Skyhorse Publishing. It'll be distributed through Simon. Thank you for that, Steve, for that plug. It's called Work Smart Now, and if you get bored here, you can go on Amazon and pre-order it. It's a book on productivity, and a lot of these issues will be addressed in that too. Thanks very much for the plug, Steve. Appreciate it.
And no one's going to get bored on this call. It's nothing but exciting stuff, I can assure everyone.
Well, you might when I start talking.
Thank you. All right, well, great. So for the next part, we're going to go through some real life stories. I'm going to describe the scenario, and then I'm going to go down the list, David, Trent, Cheryl, and Richard, and just kind of ask for their thoughts on the particular situation on how it affects their field of expertise. So the first one, listen up. An employee based in Houston, Texas. During COVID, the employee returned to Europe to be with his family since the Houston offices were closed indefinitely. After being in Europe for 4 to 5 months, the employee asked to return to Houston for a client project. The project lasted for a few weeks, and now the employee wants to return to Europe indefinitely since he or she is working remote still. David, how does this impact payroll compliance, and what risks does this strategy create for corporate compliance?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. It reminds me a little bit of being back at school and having an exam question thrown at me in front of the rest of the class. So after a few shivers, yeah, I mean, this is a scenario we see coming up quite a bit, and obviously the first you've mentioned just Europe as a depends which country they're in. So of course the first thing to ask really is, are they able to work in that? From an immigration perspective, looking at that, can they get through the border to begin with? Let's assume that's a yes. Then you look at the country they go into. So it's almost like a framework approach around, as you say, the payroll requirement, the activity of the individual, what that means is there an entity of that company within that location as well? So very similar to some of the points that Richard was mentioning. Depending on the number of days and the activities, typically you look at domestic tax first. So what are the domestic requirements for that individual in that other country while they're working? There could be a domestic payroll requirement. Well, immediately that means there's potentially 2 payrolls to look at. So you're looking at a shadow payroll potentially arrangement in that other country. And then on top of that, you're looking at Social Security. What are the issues around that? Is there a requirement to pay that locally whilst they're working? So you look at the domestic arrangements first, and you look at, say, for the employer obligations towards for that employee. Now, typically there's a tax treaty, certainly between the US and Europe. That's a good, some treaties both from a income tax perspective and totalization, so Social Security agreements. So you're then looking at what reliefs are available during that period whilst they're in that other country. the European country may have also made some local COVID relief, sort of announcements as well, where they exempt certain periods of time, where an individual might have been stranded or is working remotely for various reasons. So again, documentation of that is quite important. I think you mentioned, if I remember right, this is the one where the person comes back to Houston. Is that right, for a project for a few weeks?
Yes, comes
then
back.
he's going permanently. Yeah, sorry, I just remembered just to get the exam question right, get the full maximum points. So coming whilst they're on the US payroll, obviously still being paid out of the US, etc. There's various things that can be done on the US payroll side as well. But if they're back in Houston, then you're looking, obviously that's taxable. They're a US citizen, presumably. We're guessing, making some assumptions here. They're always going to be taxed on their worldwide income, but the payroll would still be in operation. When they're going back to the European country on a more permanent basis, which I think is what you were, the last point of the question was, that's when companies really need to think about, well, if that's a long-term move, do they still need to be a US employee overall? And a number of companies then are starting to think, well, that would be a more localized move, a long-term or an employee in the European country. Now, what does that look like again from pay and benefits and all those other aspects? That's when you get into different sort of stages of negotiation. But certainly for that sort of temporary period, the sort of longer term temporary period, that's where some of the issues may come up around double withholding, so shadow payrolls, utilization of totalization agreements for social security and tax treaties, and ultimately just keeping track of the whereabouts and the activities of that individual. I'll just say one last thing. If there is no entity in that European country, that's where you get into other aspects. So for example, there may not be a branch or a subsidiary in that European country. So then you're looking at permanent establishment issues. Has that created, is the activity, as a presence of that individual in that European country created an issue where the company now needs to report their presence in that country? So again, corporate as well as individual and payroll tax issues.
All right, a lot to consider there. Thank you, David, for those thoughts. Now I'm going to go on to Richard. Really the same question, just a quick recap of this scenario. Houston-based employee goes back to Europe because he's working remote anyway. He just thought he'd spend the time with the family, then comes back to the United States after about 5 months for a 2 to 3 week project. Now wants to go back to his home country in Europe. What are the so in that scenario, would that employee be covered, and what do you do if they're not, Richard?
Well, it could be covered. If he's under a U.S. medical plan, it's likely he's covered for worldwide coverage. However, administering the plan may be difficult and almost may be impossible. If he's covered under an HMO, for example, or preferred provider arrangement, they wouldn't have the same providers in that country that they would have here, so the benefits themselves would be greatly reduced. This case, so that in the case, that's not just him, it's also his family as well. It sounded like in this scenario, he was bringing his family with him because the office was closed in Houston, so he just grabbed everybody and went to Europe, whatever country that was in Europe. There are alternatives. Should that happen, and that happens as an employer, and you have proper tracking system in place, or you're informed in advance, you could put an international program in place for the individual and cover the individual worldwide through any number of international medical providers that can do so. Coming back, that same insurance program will cover them in the US as well. Now, one other issue that can happen here, which has happened, they'll go to a foreign country and they'll feel like, great, we're on vacation or our honeymoon for 4 or 5 months, and then they become ill, and the illness is big enough to come home to seek medical care, which almost universally everybody does. Even in Mexico, where the care isn't as good as the United States, when they're located, this executive's located in Mexico, they'll go back to Mexico to get care because they feel more comfortable doing so. So coming back would be an issue if they're not covered, or they leave the U.S. medical plan to be covered in some sort of a European plan. Finally, if they're become permanent residents, as it indicates here, they want to go back and live there again. If there is the foundation for a benefit program, meaning a legal entity and so on, then they can get a local program, and then should probably be localized at that point, because now they have left it sounds like permanently. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, again, a lot to consider there.
Yeah.
Same scenario for Trent regarding employment law. Does this arrangement trigger new entitlements or obligations? And if so, why should we maybe say no?
So this is these are real scenarios that we hear about, that I get calls on, and I'm really looking forward to Cheryl following me up, because I'm going to list out the parade of horribles, and then Cheryl's going to say, here's how we address them. Because the good news is you can address them, as both David and Richard have said. When you think about it, if this is something, a benefit you want to provide, you just have to figure out how to do it. And it's not always easy, and sometimes you have to say no. But there's a lot of things you can do to help say yes in a number of these situations. So let me start off by framing the answer with the concept of place of employment. That's a big deal in employment law. And it essentially means if I hire my Burger King employee to work at my Burger King restaurant in New York City, from day one, New York City covers that person, the laws. I have to provide wages under New York City law. I have to provide sick leave entitlements under New York City law. They can sue for discrimination under New York City law, day one. If I hire a remote worker who lives in New York City and I'm based in Houston, but I say, you can work in New York City from your home, day one, New York City law applies. I have to give them paid sick leave. I have to provide them benefits. They can, everything that applies to the Burger King worker applies to the remote worker who you hire to work in his or her house in New York City. Now, we get into some questions about place of employment in a situation like this. I have somebody who temporarily was like, I'm working from home. I'm going to go see my family in Europe. I'm going to be there 4 or 5 months. Is that 4 or 5 months? Does that change, in this case, his place of employment? That's kind of a fact. The answer is, from a legal side, it depends, right? And if he's there for a long period of time, on the second draft where he's like, I'm going to go there indefinitely, oh, sure. The chances of you changing his place of employment to the Europe are almost certain by that point. But somebody is, in this case, what about the first 4 or 5 months? He was just there, he was working, maybe he was going to come back, and in that case, we're sort of drifting into rule of thumb areas. And my rule of thumb is, once somebody has been in a country long enough to be permanent resident under the tax laws, it becomes really hard to say to an employment agency, they're there temporarily, right? It just is a hard argument to make. And so that's my rule of thumb, really. We usually say 90 days because that's safe for employment reasons. 6 months, we're really treading into some dangerous waters by that point in terms of employment. So what are the parade of horribles? Place of employment governs, not place of employer, place of employment. So what does that mean? What are the things you have to look for? Let's remember that the US is the Wild West of employment entitlements. That means we are known for being crazy employer friendly. The rest of the world has mandatory sick leave. The rest of the world has mandatory maternity leave. The rest of the world has mandatory annual leave, right? So outside the US, you're automatically looking at, okay, if I've allowed somebody to work outside of the US, I now may have just signed on to mandatory leave benefits, right? Let me give you, if we're talking about France, maternity leave, 16 weeks, right? Childcare leave in China is a year. You can't fire them for any reason once they're on that leave. We're talking about annual leave. It ranges all over the place. We're talking about family leaves in Japan for up to 2 years to take care of a child that you have to give that individual. So you may be running into some of those issues. Wage issues are common. We're used to the whole, they don't need to pay overtime, they're managers, but not everybody has that. So Are they entitled to premium pay because they worked between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m.? If you're in Japan, that applies to executives, right? Or if you're in Russia, am I giving them mandatory increases to their salary every year that are commensurate to the inflation? These are all things that vary by country that we may be signing on to. We didn't know that we were signing on to. And the list goes on: work injury, notice, termination rights, right? I look at South Korea, can you fire this person? Not unless you want to pay them 2 or 3 years of salary to get them to leave on their own. I mean, when I say years, I emphasize years of salary unless you have darn good reason, like they smuggled $1 million. So why am I not working in South Korea? And I'm in Singapore, where I can get fired anytime they want to fire me. I don't know. I should move to Seoul. At any rate, that's sort of the high level thing. And so my takeaway is, right, employees don't get to decide where to work. You are the employer and you decide where people work. And just because people are remote, right, we're seeing this sort of entitlement increase where they think I'm remote, I have a laptop, I can work anywhere. That's not true. You still, as the employer, may need to show some tough love and remind them and say, your place of employment is Houston. In this case, we didn't hire you to work in Europe. And I know you're working remotely, but we're set up for Houston, and that means you work in Houston. And if you leave, you got to tell me, because otherwise we got all these other problems: tax, insurance, and now employment, that we're going to have to work through. And can we work through them? Well, of course we can. That's where Cheryl comes in.
Thanks, Trent. Yeah, I think a lot of those issues that you brought up are issues that we've been working through. So this example is one that has come up many times. And so, like I said, we launched our Future of Work program back in September. And part of that program was putting together a new mobility and compensation policy directly for these types of requests. So, and what we're calling them is employee requested moves. So because they aren't driven by the business and really driven by the employee, it's a request, which I think is key, a request that they're making, not a decision that they're making, right? So that is the first step of the process. So we actually created a we're calling it like a help now form in our system, where an employee goes in and actually requests this. It goes to their manager first to even want to start the conversation about making one of these moves. And in this scenario, we actually built into our mobility and compensation policy that we're going to take a look at these anywhere after 60 days. So we took a pretty strong stance on, internationally, 60 days was going to be our cutoff, because we needed to look at something that was going to work for our entire, globe, right, all around the world. And so during that process, we worked with legal, corporate tax, we worked with a compensation team. And so in that policy, we talked about the steps that employee would need to take, and also understanding that both domestically and internationally, your comp may change, and we will be doing a compensation review. So where my team came in is for all of the international moves, we put together a viability assessment where we had all of the checks and balances that we needed to go through in order to fully assess whether we can approve the move or not. So I think the first two that were really important are, comp, right? So compensation. So if they're moving to a higher cost location, one, the manager in the business has to be prepared to absorb that cost. So sometimes when that came up, that was a hard stop there. Going to a lower cost country or location, sometimes the employee, a good example was, we've seen movement within Europe where they're going from maybe the UK to Poland, and they wanted to keep their UK salary, of course. And so when we presented them with a localized package for Poland, that was a hard stop from the employee's perspective. Even though they knew that they wanted to go home and work remotely for 3-4 months.
Let me ask you a question. Did that, for that kind of an employee, did they go to Poland anyway and just not tell you?
So I'll talk about that group later. We're playing a little cleanup action. But for those that we knew about before they requested it, we went through the whole process of, of course, talking to legal, talking to corporate tax, making sure that we were kind of checking everything off of whether the employee could be remote. And in Europe, I don't think we've talked about this yet, but their original offer letters didn't talk about them being remote at all. So we've had to have an entire project within EMEA to work with our legal teams, our offers teams, to make sure that we have addendums for this type of work. Because in the US, I don't think it needs to be in the offer letters, but in EMEA, we're finding that it does. So that we had to work with work councils, and that's been, I think, a longer process there for EMEA. But Richard, you bring up a good question. So what about the people that already went and did it? So right now we're in the midst of a whole process internally of confirming locations. So we're asking employees to come back to us and confirm, are you working in the location that you're contracted to work out of? And you have to confirm. It goes to your manager, and we're working through escalations for those that didn't fill it out over the next couple of weeks. So that's been our way of kind of seeing, okay, who else is out there? So, and there's been, I mean, this has been from, top of the organization down, a lot of communications on this, a lot of buy-in from our executives, understanding all the risks that, that some that we haven't even talked about from a security perspective. Where are our employees? How do we keep them safe? How do we, and then, from a risk perspective, okay, all right, now we're in 2021. Like we really need to know what our risk is and what's out there.
All right, that was some tough love there from Cheryl Craig. Thank you. All right,
but hold on, Steve, because the whole philosophy is, and the reason we rolled it out was employee choice, right? We do want to offer that flexibility, but the answer isn't always going to be yes.
Yeah. All right, so we do have a few more real life scenarios, but we did get our first first question for the panel, so I'm going to go ahead and turn to that one, and then I'm going to leave it to, and I'm thinking all the panelists are like, oh, I didn't see that question, so I'm going to read it. Here we are. Question from Michael for the panel. Right now, we are not allowed to travel, but once we can, there will be many people wanting to see family and friends they haven't seen in months or in some cases years, but will need to quarantine for 1 to 2 weeks when they arrive before they can see family. Employees will likely want to work while they're in quarantine, but won't have enough PTO to do so. But I've seen many firms taking a clear, quote, no remote working approach. How do we reconcile this with the risks the panel have been discussing? Anybody can jump in. Anybody but me.
I would just throw in there, I think, and Cheryl was touched on this already, I think you really need to look at policy and process before you can't just say, yeah, you can go ahead and do that. I think that's really what this question is about, is the approval process. You need to work out that risk, unfortunately, for each scenario, because you don't know where they're going or anything. So it really does, I think, point to having an approval process whereby it's, unfortunately, no, you can't work, and it's unpaid leave or it's some other arrangement. And I think that could be one option. Or if there is an entity there and we're going to allow you up to 30 days, because we've been seeing that quite a bit. There's a sort of market approach to sort of say, hey, first 30 days, we're not going to worry. Well, that's not necessarily strictly correct in every scenario and you're going to go into, but you have to assess your risk tolerance, I guess, from a corporate perspective around this. That's my thoughts for that. I don't know whether anyone else agrees or.
Yeah, no, and I think we're going to talk about these shorter term things in an upcoming panel, more deliberately. But the same issues we've talked about today for long term apply in the short term, as David said. And there are strategies you can use, as you said, unpaid leave or paid leave, or some other sort of make sure they go over holidays, limit their time working, whatever it is. I've seen people getting all creative on this, but it is an issue. And I think the takeaway is, whatever you do, go in with eyes open as to what the risks are and adjust for those.
I think what's important, this will probably come up a lot. I think you need to understand for your company what your risk tolerance is. And And that's why we included that 60 days, right, in our policy. So we know that this might come up for a week here, 2 weeks here. And they've probably talked to their manager about it, but when it's creeping up on that 60 days is when we really need to get involved.
And it's interesting, I know from Cheryl, it's true. In certain industries, this is becoming more of an expected benefit. And I work with a number of tech companies and software and game company, those that produce video games. And this issue of remote work anywhere you want to work is becoming more and more of an expectation of that employee population. So companies are coming squarely into focus with, well, how do I make this happen? And what are my options? And so everything that Cheryl set out needs to be addressed. How do we address wages? How do we address benefits? What's it going to be? What are our options if we don't have an entity there? Can we say yes in that country, or do we just say no? And so I think we're going to see in some of these industries, or perhaps some of the more flexible industries, a full remote workforce happening. And then, that brings on from the employment law perspective, in addition to these issues, is what does that do for our employment policies? And now are we creating new handbooks that I have to create that have to be submitted with government authorities in, Indonesia or Japan or Korea, wherever they're living. So it's a ball that rolls, and it's like a snowball that you've got to be able to manage as it grows and be ready to do the things you'll need to do when you roll it out.
And from an employee benefits perspective, number one for that individual would be make sure your medical plan covers you if you become ill. And if not, there are supplemental programs, we call them BTMs, business travel medical programs, that you can buy very inexpensive should there be an emergency that you need to have coverage right away.
Yeah, sorry, and just to add on, Steve, because I know this is all about us adding on, so it's going to be one of those sort of sessions, but I would just say quickly, immigration, make sure that person can actually work in that country. Different going in on a tourist visa or visiting family versus actually working in that country. And I'd say just track days and what are they doing? If you don't know the activity they're actually performing while they're over there, they're a trader, that could be all sorts of issues. So there's, they're lots to think about in my, just in our little panel here. So.
And by the way, Tulsa, Oklahoma is offering $10,000 cash for anybody who will move there permanently. And Barbados is offering tremendous benefits if you want to live on the beach too. Those are facts. There are many incentives that countries and cities are taking advantage of and trying to attract employees to their cities and countries.
All right, well, we are getting a bunch more panel questions. So I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to go back to some real life scenarios here. Next question is for Cheryl from Kelly. When you say you change the employee comp package if they are going to another country for more than 60 days, do you do them from home country and hire to the country where they are now working?
Yeah, so it's pretty simply localization, right? So what we're doing is going through the whole process of when we would localize an employee from one country to another. So assessing, the first was comp, the second, being immigration. Those are the first two. I think the question came up here of entity too. We do not, if they're asking to go to a place where we do not have an entity, the answer is no. But we're doing a full package, so comp benefits, and they will be a localized employee of that new country. And I think Trent really mentioned this, but it's important for the manager to also understand, okay, maybe it's going to work from a business perspective, and maybe it's going to work that they can have their employee be remote and working out of that location. But the termination and all the other employment benefits that Trent discussed, I think sometimes the manager and the business doesn't understand that the full picture of what this means to just let somebody else work remotely. So the employee might understand it and be fully aware, but the manager sometimes doesn't know what they're signing up for.
And someone wants to know, are you adjusting compensation for short-termers as well?
Yeah, so when the when the very short-term needs come up, when we dive deeper, are they asking for short-term just because they're trying to skirt around the rules here, or are they asking for short-term because there's really a need to be in another country for a short-term? So sometimes we go back to the business and say, okay, the rules are localization, but can the business absorb an assignment in this case? And we did have to do some assignments for those that were displaced due to the pandemic and COVID, where it didn't make sense to localize them. They were going to be going back home, but they were, the borders were closed and they couldn't get back. So in those situations, we are diving in a little bit deeper. But if the business, for some reason, can't absorb that assignment cost, then it is, yes, a localization.
Okay. Thank you for that. All right. Now back to the real life stories here. Here's the scenario, and I'm going to go down the list starting with David. Business hires employee whose husband is being assigned to Asia. Business wants to keep employee employed while she is a trailing spouse in Asia for 3 to 5 years. David, how does this impact payroll compliance? And what risk does this strategy create for corporate compliance?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I'll keep this quick. And I've seen this. This is a scenario that's arisen before, even pre-pandemic. So typically, you need to look at I'll start with immigration first, and the very first point of that. And I'm not an immigration specialist, but first of all, can the spouse actually work in that other country? Does the visa allow that? So making sure they're on the right visa is important. Secondly, then you're looking at some of the corporate risks. Again, activities of the individual. Is there an entity there already? What sort of other arrangements are there that locally that might prohibit that sort of type of work? There was one example, real life example, where the individual she ended up being self-employed by, just because she couldn't actually be an employee performing the duties that she was actually, they required regulatory registration as well as, just sort of regular taxation side of things. Once you're through all those sorts of questions, then you are into, well, what are the local requirements around payroll as well? So, is there a corporate presence? Yes, no. If there isn't, does that create a corporate presence? Is there a payroll requirement to actually operate whilst the individual's there? Let's say there is, in this example. Well, how's that going to operate if there isn't an entity? So does the payroll have to be operated by the individual or outsourced to a GEO kind of arrangement? Those are the sort of questions that come up in that respect. So again, you're going through a sort of a checklist for that scenario. I would say, that company, it could be their first international move. I mean, that's the other thought around this as well. It might not be something they're used to. So again, it goes back to the comp, the benefits, what's actually within the package for that individual whilst they're working there for 3 to 5 years. So yeah, lots to think about there. Predominantly, can they do it? Are they creating a corporate presence? And yeah, payroll is likely to be needed if the country has a payroll requirement.
All right, lots to consider there. Richard, what's the employee benefit situation look like for this scenario?
Okay, so let me first add to the assumptions to make it more specific. Let's take a country, let's just say Hong Kong, okay? The individual's moving to Hong Kong, the trailing spouse will remain in Houston, okay? Since we used that before, it doesn't really matter. The individual, then I'm making an assumption too that if they're going to transfer the individual, it's likely they're going to have, I'm making the assumption there's an underlying legal entity there, there's already office. This is an expatriate assignment to me. And then the question is, does the employer have an expatriate policy in place? And if they do, then it's already spelled out there what that benefit program will be and what it will look like, what the comp program will be, where it will be tax equalization of some sort, a balance sheet approach for the direct cash comp. And then on employee benefits, will they then therefore qualify for one of these international medical insurance policies that the employer already has in place? And if not, then you have to really develop, and now's the time that everyone's doing it if they don't have it, an expatriate or relocation policy that if they hadn't had that already. With respect to the trailing spouse, so let's make assumption they have that policy. The policy would generally say, all right, you now go into the X insurance company's expatriate policy. You're off of our local U.S. medical plan, and you're into the international medical policy. And that's a worldwide policy, because it has to be, because now we have a trailing spouse, right? And over here, you've got somebody in Hong Kong, the worker, you have the spouse and maybe children here in Houston. And statistically, this person is going to have 75% of the medical claims. So that's why it's very important to have a global policy that works both for local providers in Hong Kong, and there are those that do have relationships with preferred provider organizations in Hong Kong, plus the preferred provider organization here. So it's almost a seamless transition for the employee. And if the individual gets ill in Hong Kong and has to come all the way back to Houston to be with their family, that's also covered at the benefit program. And they're generally, by the way, these international medical programs generally provide better benefits than the local programs might provide. Now, should the person become disabled, right? That kicks in that we talk about the 4 core benefit programs. If the person becomes disabled in Hong Kong, that person will likely come back to the United States to be with their family and continue under the U.S. Long-term disability policy. Short-term disability benefits would apply. Trent can confirm this or not, but likely from what I heard from you say before, local Hong Kong law, right? Then question 2, now we go into retirement, one of the other core benefits, right? Hong Kong happens to have a mandatory provident fund. So I believe it's 5% of their salary, they contribute both 5 and 5, will go into this mandatory provident fund. And then you have that issue, depending how long the person's going to be there, and set 3 to 5 years. And 5 years usually is the most anybody would be under an expatriate. Once you're after 5 years, you'd localize the person. But then even then, you have that problem with the mandatory provident fund contributions going in there and not into the U.S. Social Security system. And then how are you going to reconcile that later when the person has 40 or 35 years of service? That becomes an issue, and not insurmountable, but it's more likely if it's 3 to 5 years and that's their only assignment. In fact, my colleague, I'm going to use your name, Diana. My colleague, Diana, I won't use your last name, Diana, but everybody knows who you are anyway. But my colleague, Diana, had this issue when she was transferred to Hong Kong, and then she came back to the United States, and that Hong Kong benefit is nowhere to be found. So she's got shortchanged on her Social Security benefits in the United States and going to have a lower Social Security benefit. That's very unfortunate. There are international savings plans, ISPs we call them now. They used to be called international pension plans because of all the regulatory stuff. We changed the word to savings so nobody gets confused. It's not retirement, it's savings. And there are those programs for those remote workers. Like if that individual moved from Hong Kong, then to Germany, then to Japan, then he's going to end up with no social system. And these international savings plans fill the gaps for that purpose. Long-winded. If he dies, by the way, that's easy. You kick him twice and you pay the claim. That's what we say in the insurance business. Right? And then they can pay the claim back to the person in Houston, and it's a tax-free benefit for the beneficiary in the United States. There we go. How's that?
That's a mouthful, but we'll take it. And is this a good time for me to bring up GEX? One of the audience members mentioned GEX in this. Wanted us to talk about it. Is it appropriate?
So global employment companies. Yeah, I've seen this topic come up a little bit recently. I think they've gained a bit of interest. I think I feel there's a bit of a jury still out there. The GECs that I was dealing with in the past were basically always challenged by some the countries that where that individual ended up being employed out of for form and substance. What is the purpose of the GEC? What's actually are you doing this for? So I think I would say it's a possibility, and I know that it's been sort of mooted.
David, what is a GEC for those of us?
A global employment company. So typically you cease to be employed by the entity that your local entity, and you move to more of a global employer. But that's arguably that's the challenge, is that it ends up just being a shell sort of structure rather than an actual sort of an entity with substance, form and substance. So it's like what is actually the purpose of this, other than to in some cases it was for tax savings, social security savings were the main sort of reasons for it. I think we're looking now at does it work from an employment aspects, where you might have a employer able to have an employing entity in another country out of a GEC, as opposed to it being a US individual going to Hong Kong. The GEC becomes the employer for Hong Kong purposes, but Hong Kong may challenge, as I say, the substance over that what is it? What's this company there for? So yeah, I think that's more work on that, but I know it's been suggested in a few portals.
Yeah, and I don't see them used very much these days anyway, but I think back to, on one of the points I thought we should talk through is this situation, whether she's a trailing spouse or whether she's somebody who's like, I'm done living in Houston, I want to go back to England, for 5 years. The issues are really the same, but I did want to point out two quick things. Look, there's options that you have in a situation like this. And what I often hear is, oh my gosh, this is the only woman on the planet who does what she does. And, she is a unicorn. And I've looked in 25 countries to find this one person. We have to keep her. So the business, right? They say that. And I've been doing this long enough that, of course, I nod and agree and say, of course, she's the only person on the planet who can do this. So here's your options, right? If you have an entity there, it's easy, like Cheryl said. It's, you can transfer them, localize them at that entity and say, work from here forever, as long as the business understands what that's going to mean in terms of any intercompany reimbursements or costs to the business, whatever. You'll work through those. It's a relatively easy process. But when you don't have an entity there, you can say, no, we don't have an entity there. Or the business says she's a unicorn, we have to have her. Then you're like, okay, is this a country that's going to allow me to do this work as a consultant, i.e. an independent contractor? And there's a slew of options across the globe and many different countries. In this area, there's actually a lot of similarity across the globe in terms of whether or not an individual is an employee or contractor. A number of countries have this middle ground dependent contractor that has some employment rights, some not. But at any rate, you could look at that. I know a company that called me a few months ago and said, guess what? We have 400 contractors in the Philippines. Is that a good idea? And I was like, well, maybe we went a little too far. At any rate, then you've got these professional employer organizations, many of whom sort of operate in, I'll say, sort of a gray area of, are they a staffing company? No, they work for offshore employees, but they promise the benefit of, I will be the onshore employer for you offshore company. And that has pros and cons I won't get into. Pros and risks, I'll say, not cons. And then, or you in a company like the UK where you can legitimately employ somebody as an offshore employer without having a local entity. Or do you bite the bullet because this is really an important person and maybe this is a region you want to expand into? Those are essentially your 4 options in a situation like that. But I don't want to hijack anything, but I saw a question I thought Cheryl may want to touch on. We talked about, so we have these rules that say you can't leave unless, here's your place. And I've mentioned place of employment is Houston. If you leave, Cheryl, what do you do when you find out that somebody didn't tell you?
So we've asked them all to return home. We've strongly worded that they return home. So that's been the message. We also are looking at putting them on leaves of absence and in some cases termination. So it really depends, especially in those cases where they're working out of a place where we don't have an entity, we might have to take some strong action there. But again, this communication has been going out for a long time. So the employees have had time to kind of stew on it and decide, what's best for them. And then we've been working with the business as well to prepare them too.
All right. Anybody have anything else to add to that before we have a lot of panel questions? Sorry, a lot of questions for the panel. So I'm going to go to this next one here. And if you see me squinting, the font is very small, so just bear with me. What if you cut employees loose and categorize them as contractors? Does that put the burden on the contractor and free the company from tax and benefit issues? Or is there still a duty of care that applies in this case? That's a good one.
It is a good one. All kinds of issues with that. But Does it happen? Yes. Is it an option? Yes. And the stomach for risk becomes a big issue in that situation, because if they've been an employee for you and now you're making them a contractor, but they're doing exactly the same thing they were doing before, reporting to the same people they reported to before, then it looks like a facade. And if they challenged it locally, they'll probably still be viewed as an employee in that jurisdiction. Does it free you from tax? Well, theoretically, yes, if they in fact truly are an independent contractor and you treat them that way. So it is there is an analysis you'll want to work through to manage your risks. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've just been self-true about the UK. There's anti-avoidance legislation around this in the UK. So, and this isn't the first time this has come up. This has been decades that these sort of arrangements are looked at. Just make him a contractor, but they're still taking direction from us. And that's there's employment law, tax, you name it. It's all big issues around that. So agreed.
Yeah, with respect to benefits, then they wouldn't qualify for the employee benefit programs. And thank you, Diana, for the question.
All right, I think we got time. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and sometimes, like Richard, that's a deciding factor. Like Cheryl was saying, when the employee understands what they're really asking, oh, sure, we can make you a contractor, but that now means that you're going to work on a project basis only as needed, and you don't get benefits anymore. And maybe you need to set up your own company while you're at it, now contract with your company. And most of the people are like, yeah, okay, never mind. I'll stay where I am.
All right.
Cheryl, has anybody brought that to you specifically, saying, I want out, I want to be a contractor, I want to be a 1099 employee?
That has come up in former companies, but not yet in my current role. But I do agree. I think there's a lot of legwork that goes into like whether that or not that's an actual possibility, especially if they've been working for you and they're going to be doing the same job in just a different location. It's a little obvious.
All right.
It used to be expression. Sorry, it used to be expression. If it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, and it is a duck, right? As an employee.
Too true.
All right, we're coming close to the end of our time, so I have one more question, and then I think we'll wrap things up. This is again from the audience.
No, I don't want to go. I'm having fun.
You can stay. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay on here.
Okay.
So, when you localize employees and whose interest is the employee working, either be home or host country entity, which entity absorbs the cost of the employee? How can you make the headcount available in the country of localization? I'm not sure I read that correctly. Which entity absorbs the cost of the employee, and how can you make headcount available in the country of localization? You guys follow that?
No.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah. So, I get it. I mean, essentially, you're saying if I localize somebody, who's going to foot the bill for that company? Who's going to foot the bill for that person? And if they're moving to Belarus and I have an office of 3 people in Belarus, how am I going to be able to convince Belarus to take on another employee when the work is going to be all US based, for example? And the question is, that really does become a negotiation for the business, in addition to sort of the employment cost issues, where you may be considering, what about the intercompany transfer, and how does that impact all of the taxes associated with transfer between the companies? So what you've raised is a really good question that definitely needs to be worked through when that issue arises.
All right, I'm going to try and sneak in one more question, unless David, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I was agreed.
Okay. All right, I'm going to one more question here. Would anyone here in the panel recommend using an international PEO or GEO company for remote workers? Would that work?
Yes.
Companies are doing it regularly.
Yeah. They're already doing it. Yeah, I see it quite a bit with business travelers or remote workers, where from an employer of record option that they're following, they're using more GEOs. you have to check them out because obviously some may not be able to operate in across borders. Yeah, we work with quite a few already, so I won't recommend it.
Yeah, when you're looking at people to use, you're going to want to look at, you should be asking questions like, can they sponsor a visa? Because that's not possible in all locations. So if somebody's going there that doesn't have a local immigration visa, they may not be able to help you. But in addition to that, you'll want to be sure it's a reputable location that does things by the book. And if they do, it can be a relatively low risk endeavor for the company, provided they, give you a good indemnification clause and they're good for their money. So.
And they happen to be very expensive, by the way, because they add the employee benefit costs plus their administrative costs, and they're at least 25% more expensive than if you had the employee hired on your own.
Right, and if they're going from if the business is moving from the US to France, which already has a higher cost per employee, and then you add the administrative fee, that can be non-persuasive. So.
All right. Well, I think that about does it. This is being recorded, so we will send the recording out to everybody that's registered for this. I'll include everyone's contact details on that email as well. And thank you, David Levitt, Richard Polak, Cheryl Craig, and Trent Sutton. This has been a really great discussion, and I look forward to having everybody join us on March 24th, where we do the same thing for short-term remote workers. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Great job, Steve. Thank you.